Laura is used to difficulties at work, but she never imagined that she would face discrimination right on the street during an ordinary walk with her children. How far will the police officers go in their biased accusations? And how will this encounter end? Watch to the end to find out the truth. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Write in the comments, what do you think you would have done in her shoes? It was a Saturday morning and the day seemed perfect. The sun hung softly in the cloudless sky, casting a golden glow over the sleepy suburban neighborhood. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of dew-kissed grass and the occasional whiff of blooming flowers. Tall trees lined the streets, their green leaves rustling lightly in the breeze, creating an atmosphere of peace and serenity. Laura, a black woman in her mid-30s, was walking along the quiet neighborhood paths with her two young sons, Jake, 8, and Ben, 5. The weekend had finally arrived, and it was a rare moment of calm for her, a judge who often found herself overwhelmed by the weight of her job. It was one of those rare Saturdays where she wasn't thinking about court cases or civil rights battles, but simply enjoying the precious time with her boys. Laura glanced down at her sons, who were a few steps ahead of her, their laughter filling the air. Jake, with his boundless energy and endless curiosity, was excitedly pointing at a squirrel that darted across the street, while Ben, the quieter of the two, clung to his mother's hand whenever he could. Both boys were white, their pale skin and light brown hair contrasting sharply with Laura's deep, chocolate complexion. But to her, they were just her children. She didn't care about the stares she occasionally got from strangers who seemed puzzled by the racial contrast in their family. In these moments, she reflected on her life as a mother and a judge. Despite the long hours in courtrooms and the constant weight of responsibility on her shoulders, these walks reminded her why she fought so hard every day. For her boys, for her family, and for all the black people who looked to her as a symbol of hope and justice. She knew that raising two white boys in a racially charged society was not without its challenges, but she was determined to instill in them the values of empathy, fairness, and justice. Jake ran ahead, laughing as he tried to keep up with a bird that was hopping from branch to branch. "Mom, look at this!" he shouted excitedly, waving his hand to show her something on the ground. Ben, though more reserved, smiled softly, tugging gently at Laura's hand, signaling his desire to stay close to her. The neighborhood was quiet. The houses were large, their manicured lawns sprawling and pristine, the streets almost empty, except for a few parked cars and an occasional dog walker. It was a picturesque, peaceful area, the kind of place where families felt safe, where the problems of the world seemed distant. Laura felt a wave of gratitude as she continued to stroll down the green-lined streets with her children. But her peace was short-lived. As they turned the corner onto a quieter street, a distant rumble caught Laura's attention. She glanced up and saw a police car slowly making its way toward them. At first, she thought nothing of it. Police patrols were common in this neighborhood, a sign of safety, she told herself. But something about the way the car slowed as it neared them, the way it lingered, caused a knot to form in her stomach. The car crept closer and then stopped directly across from them. Laura's heart skipped a beat, though she told herself to remain calm. It was probably nothing, she thought. Just a regular patrol. Perhaps the officers were looking for someone or checking the area. There was no reason for concern. Still, a familiar unease settled over her, a feeling she had come to know all too well over the years. Two officers stepped out of the vehicle. One was older, his face hard and impassive, his eyes scanning the scene with a cold intensity. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern expression that immediately put Laura on edge. The younger officer, who appeared to be in his late 20s, followed closely behind. He seemed less confident, glancing nervously between Laura and the children. His demeanor wasn't quite as threatening, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. They approached Laura and the boys slowly, their boots crunching on the gravel of the sidewalk. Laura felt her pulse quicken. She had been in situations like this before. Too many times, in fact. She knew what might come next. She had seen that look in people's eyes before, a look that suggested they were searching for something to accuse her of. Her instincts screamed at her to remain calm, to not escalate the situation. She focused on her breathing, her eyes darting between the officers and her children. She didn't want the boys to sense her fear, didn't want them to see her uncertainty. But the officer's presence had already shifted the mood of the morning. The peaceful walk had turned into something entirely different. The older officer was the first to speak, his voice devoid of warmth. "Ma'am, are these your kids?" he asked, his eyes darting between the boys and her, the skepticism in his tone palpable. Laura's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "Yes, they are," she replied, trying to sound casual as though she hadn't noticed the suspicion in his voice. She had learned long ago that any hint of defiance or frustration could turn a minor incident into something much worse. The younger officer glanced at his partner, then back at Laura. Where did you get them?" he asked, his words fumbling, as if he knew how inappropriate the question was, but still felt compelled to ask. Laura's stomach twisted. She had heard variations of this question before, sometimes from strangers in grocery stores, sometimes from passers-by in parks, but hearing it from police officers made her blood boil. Still, she held her composure. "I adopted them," she said firmly, her eyes locking with the older officers. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, her irritation barely held in check. But the officer didn't back down. "Can we see some ID?" he asked, his tone more demanding now. His posture had shifted, as if he was ready to escalate things at the slightest provocation. Laura knew she had every right to refuse, but she also knew what could happen if she did. She glanced at her sons, who were now looking up at the officers with wide, confused eyes. Ben, sensing something wasn't right, gripped her hand more tightly. The last thing Laura wanted was for this situation to spiral out of control in front of her boys. She could feel the tension building in her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Why do you need to see my ID?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're just out for a walk." The older officer took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "We just want to make sure everything's in order," he said, his voice hard. "It's our job to check. There have been some reports of suspicious activity in the area." Laura's heart sank. She knew exactly what he was implying. She was the suspicious activity. A black woman walking with 2 white children was all it took for someone to call the police. Her mind raced, weighing her options. She could push back, refuse to show her ID, but what then? Would they arrest her? Would they traumatize her children even more? Laura's thoughts raced as she tried to figure out the best way to handle the situation. She knew how quickly things could escalate. As a judge, she had presided over countless cases where innocent people had been victimized by law enforcement. She had seen the consequences of prejudice and racial profiling, and now she was living it, right here on this peaceful Saturday morning. Her mind flashed back to other incidents, times when she had been followed in stores, questioned for no reason, or pulled over for random checks. She had always managed to keep her cool, to avoid confrontation, but this time it felt different. This time her children were watching. She glanced down at Jake and Ben. Jake was watching the officers closely, his face scrunched in confusion. Ben, on the other hand, was starting to look frightened, his eyes filling with tears as he clung to her side. Laura's heart ached at the thought of what this might do to them. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She couldn't let her anger take over, not here, not now. Her sons needed her to be strong, to stay calm. But the weight of the injustice was pressing down on her, threatening to break through her carefully maintained facade. Her mind flickered to the countless times she had faced prejudice, both subtle and overt, throughout her life. She had thought that by becoming a judge, by fighting for justice, she could rise above it. But moments like this reminded her that no matter how far she had come, some people would always see her as less than, as someone to be questioned, to be doubted. The older officer's voice cut through her thoughts. "Ma'am, we're going to need to see some identification," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Laura knew she was at a crossroads. She could comply, give them what they wanted, and hope that they would go away. Or she could stand her ground, refuse, and risk the situation spiraling out of control. Neither option felt right, but she knew she had to make a decision. She glanced down at her boys once more, her heart heavy. "Just stay close to me," she whispered to them, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. As the tension in the air thickened, Laura could feel her heart pounding against her chest. The older officer, still looming closer, hadn't taken his eyes off her. His partner, while quieter, maintained a similar air of suspicion, his hand hovering near the radio on his belt, as if ready to call for backup at any moment. The demand for her identification wasn't a question anymore. It was a command, backed by authority and years of unchecked prejudice. Laura felt a familiar weight on her shoulders, the same weight she carried every time she was forced to prove her innocence simply because of the color of her skin. She hesitated, still contemplating her next move. The older officer's eyes flickered to her hesitation, taking it as a sign of guilt. "Ma'am, I don't think I need to remind you, but we can do this the easy way, or—" He trailed off, the threat hanging in the air. His tone was cold, almost clinical, as if he'd done this 100 times before and expected the same outcome every time. The implication was clear: either comply or face the consequences. Laura's grip on Ben's hand tightened instinctively. She could feel his small, trembling fingers, and her resolve hardened. There was no way she would let this escalate to the point where her boys would see her in handcuffs. But the thought of simply giving in to their demands without any resistance burned in her chest. She was a judge, a fighter for civil rights and justice. This was everything she stood against. "Why is this necessary?" she finally asked, her voice steady but laced with the frustration she was barely containing. "I'm just walking with my children. Why do I need to show you my ID? What exactly do you think I've done?" The younger officer shifted uneasily, perhaps realizing that they were heading into murky waters. But the older one remained unmoved. His eyes narrowed and his tone grew sharper. "There have been reports in this area. Suspicious activity," he repeated, leaning into the lie. His eyes flicked back to the children, as if emphasizing the suspicious element. "We just need to make sure everything's in order, for the safety of everyone involved." For the safety of everyone. Laura almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She was a black woman walking with her white sons, and somehow that translated into danger for the neighborhood. She wanted to scream at the injustice, at the insanity of it all, but instead, she held herself together, thinking of her children. This wasn't the first time she'd been scrutinized, and it wouldn't be the last. But the difference now was that her children were involved. As the confrontation continued, Laura could sense the growing anxiety in her boys. Ben, who had been holding her hand tightly, began to shift closer to her, his small body pressed against her side. His wide eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Laura could feel him trembling. It broke her heart to see him this way. He was too young to fully understand what was happening, but he knew enough to realize that something was wrong. "Mommy!" Ben's voice was small and shaky. His bottom lip quivered as he looked up at her, fear radiating from his expression. "Are we in trouble?" Laura knelt down beside him, forcing a smile despite the tension that was building in her chest. She stroked his hair gently, trying to reassure him with her touch. "No, baby," she whispered softly, her heart breaking as she said the words. "We're not in trouble. Everything's fine. Just stay close to me, okay?" Jake, on the other hand, was more aware of the situation. At 8 years old, he understood enough to sense the confrontation brewing between his mother and the officers. His usually cheerful face was now filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. His eyes darted back and forth between the officers and Laura, trying to make sense of the hostility in the air. "Why are they asking for your ID?" Jake finally asked, his voice loud enough to catch the officer's attention. His tone was both questioning and defensive, as though he were trying to protect his mother, but didn't know how. "You didn't do anything wrong." The older officer glanced at Jake, but his expression remained impassive, as if he saw no value in explaining himself to a child. The younger officer, however, shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with the children's growing distress. Laura noticed this, but it did little to alleviate her own worry. She needed to defuse this situation before it got any worse. The older officer's patience was thinning. His gaze returned to Laura, his hand now resting firmly on his belt, close to the handcuffs. "Ma'am, you need to stop making this difficult. Show us your ID, or we're going to have to take you in. We'll let the station sort it out." Laura's blood ran cold. Take her in? The mere thought of being dragged into the police station, especially in front of her children, filled her with dread. She had read too many stories of situations like these, escalating far beyond reason, ending in humiliation, violence, or worse. She couldn't allow that to happen. Not with Jake and Ben watching. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. How far were these officers willing to go? Would they really arrest her over nothing? And if they did, what would happen to her children? Would they take the boys into custody too? The thought was unbearable. Laura's heart raced as she considered her options. She knew she had every legal right to refuse to comply with the officer's demands. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the reality of the situation was far more complicated. The law wasn't always on the side of justice when race was involved, and she couldn't afford to gamble with her son's safety. The older officer took another step forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Last chance," he said, his voice low and menacing. "ID now, or we take you downtown." The world seemed to slow down for Laura as she weighed her options. She had never been the type to back down, especially in the face of injustice. As a judge, she had built her career on fighting for the rights of those who were often marginalized and mistreated by the system. She had seen countless cases of racial profiling, of people being harassed and targeted simply because of their skin color. She had vowed to do everything in her power to stop that kind of discrimination. But right now it wasn't just about her. It was about her children. She glanced down at Ben, who was still clinging to her leg, his small body trembling with fear. Jake was standing beside her, his little hands balled into fists, trying to act brave despite the obvious fear in his eyes. They didn't understand what was happening, but they knew enough to be scared. Laura's heart ached for them. She had worked so hard to create a loving, safe environment for her boys, to shield them from the harsh realities of the world for as long as she could. But now those realities were crashing down around them, right in front of their eyes. How could she explain to them why the police, the very people who were supposed to protect them, were treating their mother like a criminal? Her anger simmered just below the surface. Every fiber of her being wanted to lash out, to tell these officers exactly what she thought of their thinly veiled racism. But she knew that wouldn't help. If she got angry, if she raised her voice or refused to comply, the situation could spiral out of control in an instant. And then what? She would be handcuffed in front of her children. They would see her taken away by the police, and the trauma of that moment would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They would grow up with the image of their mother being treated like a criminal simply because she was black. She couldn't let that happen. But could she really give in? Could she allow these officers to humiliate her, to strip away her dignity just to keep the peace? The thought made her stomach turn. She was a judge, for God's sake. She had fought her entire life to be seen for who she was, not the color of her skin. How could she just stand here and let these men reduce her to a stereotype? The older officer took another step toward her, his expression hardening. His hand was now resting firmly on the handcuffs at his side, ready to take action. Laura's pulse quickened, and she instinctively stepped back, pulling Ben closer to her. "You're really going to make me do this, aren't you?" he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're leaving me no choice." Laura's heart raced. She could see where this was going. If she didn't comply, they would arrest her. And once that happened, there was no telling what would come next. She could end up in jail, separated from her children. Or worse, the situation could escalate to violence. She had to act. She had to protect her boys. "I'm their mother," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "These are my children, and I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't need to show you my ID." The officer's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment Laura thought she saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. But then he shook his head, his expression hardening once more. "We're going to have to take you in," he said, his voice flat and final. Laura's stomach dropped. This was it. She was out of options. She glanced down at her boys, their scared faces looking up at her, and made a decision. It was time to reveal who she really was. As the officer reached for his handcuffs, Laura took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew that once she revealed her identity, everything would change. The confrontation was about to reach its breaking point, and she needed to act before the situation spiraled even further out of control. The moment was hanging in the air, thick with tension. The older officer's hand hovered over the handcuffs, his intent unmistakable. He was ready to follow through on his threat, and Laura could feel the situation slipping further out of her control. The coldness in his eyes told her that he wasn't bluffing. If she didn't comply with his demands, he would arrest her, right there in front of her children. The gravity of the situation hit Laura with full force. It was no longer a hypothetical scenario. This was real. She wasn't just facing an inconvenience or an unpleasant interaction. She was on the brink of being detained, her children possibly taken away while she spent hours, maybe even days, trying to resolve this misunderstanding. And she knew all too well that her being a black woman only made things worse in the eyes of the officers. The system had shown her time and time again that people like her weren't given the benefit of the doubt. As the older officer took another step closer, the younger officer glanced between his partner and Laura, clearly uneasy. He hadn't said much since the encounter began, but Laura could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't entirely comfortable with how this was unfolding, but he wasn't going to stand in the way either. His silence was complicit, as much a part of the problem as his partner's aggression. The older officer's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and impatient. "Ma'am, if you don't give me your ID right now, I'm going to have to place you under arrest. I'm not going to ask again." Laura's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of her children's eyes on her. Ben's hand trembled in hers, and Jake, though trying to stay composed, was visibly shaken. The thought of them witnessing their mother being dragged off in handcuffs sent a wave of dread washing over her. Ben, who had been clinging tightly to Laura's hand throughout the ordeal, couldn't hold back any longer. Tears welled up in his big, round eyes, and his small frame began to shake uncontrollably. His fear was palpable, radiating from him in waves that broke Laura's heart. "Mommy," he whimpered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of Laura's heart. "Why are they being mean to you?" Laura knelt down beside Ben, trying to shield him from the full brunt of the tension surrounding them. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close in an attempt to comfort him, though she knew it was impossible to erase the fear he was feeling. She gently wiped away his tears, forcing herself to stay calm even as her own emotions threatened to overwhelm her. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, her voice soothing despite the terror that gripped her. "Everything's going to be fine. Just stay close to me." But Ben's tears didn't stop, and Laura could feel his tiny body trembling against hers. The injustice of it all filled her with rage. Her innocent son, terrified simply because of the color of her skin. Jake, on the other hand, was trying his hardest to stay brave. But Laura could see the cracks in his composure, the way his small fist clenched and unclenched, as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. His wide eyes were fixed on the officers, his young mind grappling with the unfairness of it all. "Why are you doing this to her?" Jake asked, his voice surprisingly firm for a boy his age. His question hung in the air, directed at the officers who had created this nightmare. Laura saw the defiance in his eyes, the budding sense of injustice that mirrored her own. Even at his young age, Jake understood that what was happening wasn't right. The older officer, however, showed no sign of remorse. He didn't even glance at Jake, as if the child's words meant nothing. His focus remained solely on Laura, his expression unreadable. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, casting a quick, uneasy glance at Jake before looking away. "Ma'am, you need to stop this," the older officer said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "You're making it harder than it has to be. We're trying to do our job here, and you're refusing to cooperate." Laura could hardly believe the audacity of his words. She was making it harder? She was the one being threatened, harassed, and doubted simply for existing in public with her children. The absurdity of the situation felt like a heavy weight on her chest, crushing her spirit. The younger officer, sensing the mounting tension, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should just give her a minute," he said, his voice hesitant. "She's with her kids. Maybe we can—" The older officer cut him off with a sharp glance, his jaw tight. "We've given her plenty of chances. She's not complying, and we have protocols to follow." Laura's frustration boiled over. How had they turned a peaceful walk with her children into this nightmare? She could see it in their eyes, the disbelief, the suspicion, the assumption that she was in the wrong, simply because she was black and her children were white. They didn't believe her. They didn't care about the truth. The older officer took another step closer, the threat of arrest looming more heavily than ever. "Ma'am, we're done talking. Either you give me your ID or we're taking you in. You can explain yourself at the station." Time seemed to slow for Laura as she weighed her options, each one heavier and more difficult than the last. She could give them what they wanted, her ID, and hope that this would satisfy their twisted sense of justice. But she knew that even if she complied, the humiliation of the moment wouldn't go away. Her dignity, her pride, everything she had worked for would be stripped away by the mere act of submitting to their unjust demands. But if she refused, She risked everything. The image of herself being led away in handcuffs, her children crying and screaming for her, was a vision she couldn't shake. The thought of leaving them alone in the care of these officers, uncertain and terrified, made her physically ill. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as the familiar anger welled up inside her. She had faced injustice before. As a black woman, it was almost second nature. And yet, every time it happened, the sting was just as sharp, the weight just as heavy. She had risen above it so many times, worked so hard to prove that she was more than what society assumed her to be. But today, it wasn't just about her. It was about her boys, their innocence, their understanding of the world. She glanced down at them again, her heart breaking at the sight of their fear. They didn't deserve this. They shouldn't have to witness their mother being treated this way, shouldn't have to learn so early in life that the world could be so unfair. The thought of them growing up with this memory haunted her. She was a mother first, and in this moment, that role eclipsed everything else. As much as she wanted to fight, as much as she wanted to stand her ground, she knew she couldn't let things escalate any further. Not for her sake, but for theirs. But even as she reached this decision, her anger didn't dissipate. It simmered beneath the surface, a fire that she couldn't extinguish. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. And yet, here she was, forced to make a choice between protecting her dignity and protecting her children. Her mind raced as she weighed the consequences. She knew that revealing her identity as a judge would change the dynamic of the situation, but it wasn't a card she wanted to play lightly. There was always the risk that her position would inflame the officers further, making them feel even more challenged and defensive. But time was running out. The older officer wasn't waiting any longer. He moved closer, reaching for Laura's arm with the clear intent of placing her in handcuffs. "Turn around," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're under arrest." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Laura realized that the moment had come. The threat was no longer hypothetical. It was happening. Her worst fear was about to be realized. Her boys, her beautiful innocent boys, were about to see their mother in handcuffs, led away by the police as if she were a criminal. The thought made her sick to her stomach. Ben's sobs grew louder as he clung to her leg, refusing to let go. "No, Mommy! Don't let them take you!" Jake, though braver, looked like he was on the verge of tears. His small hands balled into fists as he stood protectively in front of his mother, trying to shield her from the officers. The sight of her children in such distress was the final straw. Laura made her decision. Before the officer could place the handcuffs on her, Laura took a deep breath and spoke in a voice that was calm but firm, filled with the authority she had earned through years of hard work and perseverance. "I'm a judge," she said, pulling out her ID badge and holding it up for the officers to see. "I am a judge for the Civil Rights Court, specifically cases involving Black Americans, and you are making a serious mistake." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with the weight of what they meant. The older officer froze, his hands still hovering near her arm, his eyes widening slightly as the realization hit him. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed, based on his own biases, that Laura was just another Black woman to be controlled, to be doubted. The younger officer's face turned pale as he glanced at his partner, unsure of what to do next. Laura could see the panic setting in, the dawning realization that they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. As the silence stretched on, Laura's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had revealed her identity, and the power dynamic had shifted in an instant. But she knew that this wasn't over. Not yet. The officers were still processing what had just happened, still grappling with the consequences of their actions. And Laura, though shaken, wasn't about to let them off the hook. The situation had reached a critical moment, and now it was time to see how the officers would respond. As the weight of her words settled in, Laura remained still, her ID badge still outstretched in her hand. She felt a rush of emotions swirling inside her. Relief, fear, anger, and frustration, all colliding as she tried to maintain her composure. Her heart was still racing, pounding against her ribcage, but her face remained calm, even though every nerve in her body was on edge. This wasn't how she wanted things to go. She hadn't wanted to play the judge card, hadn't wanted to rely on her position to escape a situation that was unjust from the start. Laura had always prided herself on standing tall in the face of adversity, of fighting back against the prejudices she encountered without using her status as a weapon. But now it seemed like she had no other choice. The moment she had flashed her badge, she felt the shift. She could see it in the officers' faces, especially the younger one. His shock was visible, his eyes wide, mouth slightly agape. He hadn't expected this. Neither had his partner. For a brief second, Laura considered taking back her words, as if revealing her identity had somehow compromised her integrity. But the situation had escalated beyond her control, and she knew it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about protecting her children, about ensuring their safety, and making sure they wouldn't carry this traumatic memory with them for the rest of their lives. But even though she had played her trump card, she knew that the real battle was just beginning. She could feel the older officer's eyes still on her, his gaze filled with anger and confusion. He had clearly not anticipated this outcome, and was now grappling with the reality that the person he had treated with suspicion and contempt was someone of authority, someone who could actually hold him accountable for his actions. For a moment, the silence hung heavy between them. The tension was palpable. Laura could feel the weight of her children's eyes on her too. They were watching her, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting for her to lead them through this storm. Despite the sudden shift, the older officer wasn't ready to back down just yet. His pride, his authority, everything was on the line. And in his mind, admitting that he had made a mistake was not an option. Laura could see the stubbornness in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched as he tried to maintain control of the situation. "So, you're a judge," he said, his voice low but tight, as though the words were difficult for him to form. "That doesn't mean you're above the law. We're just doing our job, ma'am." Laura's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone even. "No one is above the law, officer. Least of all me. But your actions here today are not about upholding the law. They're about something else entirely." Her voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it, one that made the younger officer shift nervously on his feet. The older officer's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. His hand was still dangerously close to his handcuffs, and Laura could sense that he wasn't willing to let this go without a fight. His ego was bruised, and men like him didn't like to be challenged, especially not by a black woman. He took a step closer, his posture aggressive. "We had a call about suspicious activity in the area. 2 white children with a black woman. It's our job to make sure everything is in order. You may be a judge, but we have protocols to follow." Laura could feel her anger flaring up again, but she fought to keep it in check. This man wasn't just trying to enforce the law. He was trying to assert his dominance, to show her that despite her status, she was still subject to his authority. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. He wasn't ready to back down. Behind him, the younger officer remained quiet, but his face was pale. He clearly understood the gravity of the situation, but it was clear he didn't have the strength to stand up to his partner. Laura couldn't rely on him for support, and that realization only made her angrier. "You're not following protocols," Laura said, her voice firm. "You're following prejudices. I have every right to walk with my children in this neighborhood without being harassed. You had no valid reason to stop me, and yet here we are." The older officer's eyes darkened. He was clearly not used to being talked to this way, and Laura knew that he was at a tipping point. "You're obstructing an investigation," he said coldly. "We could still take you in. Judge or not, you're not cooperating." The air around them grew thicker with tension. Laura could feel it in the way the older officer squared his shoulders, his hands still twitching near his belt, ready to escalate things at a moment's notice. He was waiting for her to push just a little too far, to give him an excuse to retaliate. His authority had been challenged, and he wasn't going to let it go easily. Her heart raced as she weighed her options. She didn't want to give him that excuse, but she couldn't let him think he had the upper hand either. She was a judge. She was well within her rights to stand up for herself and for her children, who were watching this unfold in stunned silence. She glanced down at them. Jake's fists were still clenched at his sides, his face red with anger. Ben had stopped crying, but his eyes were wide and fearful. They were scared, confused, and looking to her for guidance. She had to be strong for them, but she also had to be careful. The officer's patience was wearing thin. He took another step toward her, his eyes flashing with barely contained anger. "This is your last warning, ma'am. Show us your ID or we're taking you in." Laura swallowed the lump in her throat. She knew that this man wasn't bluffing. He would arrest her if she didn't comply, and the image of herself being handcuffed in front of her children was more than she could bear. But she wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Taking a deep breath, Laura made her decision. She had to defuse the situation before it spiraled out of control, but she also had to stand her ground. She wasn't going to let this officer intimidate her, not after everything she had been through. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet. She could feel the officer watching her every move, his posture tense, as though he was waiting for her to do something wrong. She pulled out her driver's license and held it out toward him, her hand steady. "There," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There's my ID. Now you know exactly who I am. And I hope you also understand that you're making a serious mistake." The older officer took the ID from her, his eyes scanning it quickly. She could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the realization that she had been telling the truth all along. He handed the ID back to her, his face still hard, but there was a new tension in his expression now, one of uncertainty. The younger officer, sensing the shift, finally stepped forward. "Maybe we should let this go," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I mean, she's a judge. We should probably—" The older officer shot him a sharp look, cutting him off. But the doubt was already there, and Laura could see it. His authority had been challenged, and now he was grappling with how to proceed. If he arrested her now, it could end his career. But backing down would mean admitting he was wrong, something he clearly wasn't used to. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension in the air was suffocating. Laura held her breath, waiting to see what the officer would do next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the older officer stepped back. His jaw was clenched, and his face was flushed with anger and frustration. But he didn't reach for his handcuffs. Instead, he glared at Laura, his eyes filled with resentment. "You can go," he said through gritted teeth. "But don't think this is over. We'll be filing a report." Laura didn't flinch. She knew this was the closest thing to a victory she was going to get today. The officer's pride had been wounded, but he wasn't going to push it any further. Not when he knew what was at stake. "You do that," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I'll be filing a report of my own." The officer's eyes darkened, but he didn't say anything. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the patrol car, his partner following close behind. The younger officer gave Laura a brief, apologetic glance before climbing into the car without another word. As the car pulled away, Laura let out a long, shaky breath. The confrontation was over, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Her hands were trembling slightly as she reached down to comfort her children, who were still standing close to her, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. As the police car disappeared down the street, Laura turned to her boys. Jake was still fuming, his small fists clenched tightly at his sides. Ben had gone quiet again, his eyes fixed on the spot where the officers had stood just moments before. Laura knelt down in front of them, wrapping her arms around both boys and pulling them close. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "Everything's okay now." But she knew that wasn't entirely true. The incident was over, but the scars it had left, on her children, would take time to heal. She could see it in Jake's eyes, the anger, the confusion, the sense of betrayal. And in Ben's trembling hands, the fear that still lingered after the confrontation. They were too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to know that something had been terribly wrong. As she held them close, Laura knew that this was a moment that would stay with them for a long time, and it was a moment she wouldn't soon forget either. But as she stood there, holding her children, Laura's thoughts began to shift. The confrontation was over, but the lesson wasn't. Those officers needed to understand the gravity of their actions. They needed to know that what they had done wasn't just wrong, it was a violation of her rights, a reflection of the deep-seated prejudices that still permeated the system. She wasn't going to let this go, not this time. There would be consequences, and she was going to make sure of that. The officers would soon learn that their actions had repercussions, and the lesson would be one they wouldn't soon forget. As the police car disappeared down the street, Laura stood still for a moment, her arms wrapped protectively around her children. Her heart was still pounding, and her mind was racing with the weight of everything that had just transpired. But she knew that this wasn't the end. Far from it. The confrontation may have ended, But the consequences for the officer's actions had yet to unfold. Slowly, she pulled away from Jake and Ben, kneeling down so she could look into their eyes. "Are you two okay?" she asked gently, brushing a lock of hair from Jake's forehead. Jake's face was still twisted with anger and confusion. His small fists clenched tightly at his sides. He wasn't ready to let go of what had just happened. "Why were they so mean, Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and fear. "We didn't do anything wrong. They treated you like you were a bad person." Ben, still quiet and shaken, nodded in agreement, his wide eyes glistening with unshed tears. He looked up at his mother, trying to make sense of the fear and confusion that had gripped him throughout the ordeal. Laura felt a lump form in her throat. How could she explain something so complex, so deeply rooted in the fabric of their society, to her young sons? They were too young to fully understand the systemic racism that had caused the officers to act the way they did. But she knew that this moment was crucial. This was their first real experience with the ugliness of racial prejudice, and how she handled it would shape their understanding of the world. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "You're right, Jake. We didn't do anything wrong," she began, her voice steady but soft. "What those officers did was wrong. They saw me, saw us, and made assumptions because of the way we look. They didn't care about the truth. They let their prejudice control their actions." "But why?" Jake's voice cracked, and she could see the hurt and confusion in his eyes. "Why would they do that to you? You're a judge. You help people." Laura nodded, her heart aching at the unfairness of it all. "Because sometimes people let fear and ignorance control how they see the world. Those officers saw a black woman with 2 white children, and instead of treating us with respect, they assumed the worst. They let their own biases take over." Ben sniffled, leaning into her for comfort. "But you stopped them, right?" Laura hugged him close, her heart swelling with pride for her brave, innocent boys. "Yes, baby, I stopped them, and I'll make sure they learn from this. What they did was wrong, and people like that need to understand that their actions have consequences." Jake wiped at his eyes, his anger still simmering just beneath the surface. "Are they going to get in trouble?" Laura's expression hardened slightly. "They will. I'm going to file a formal complaint about what happened. They need to understand that their behavior isn't just unfair, it's illegal. I'm going to make sure they know that." Her voice was calm, but filled with conviction. She wasn't going to let this slide. Those officers had crossed a line, and as a judge, she had the power to hold them accountable. And as a mother, she had the responsibility to ensure that her children understood that justice could and should prevail. Meanwhile, as the police car drove further away, the officers inside sat in tense silence. The older officer gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with the pressure. His jaw was clenched, and his face was flushed with a mixture of anger and frustration. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but something about the confrontation was gnawing at him. He hadn't expected the woman to be a judge. He hadn't expected her to be someone with power, someone who could actually fight back. And now, as they drove away, the reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. The younger officer sat quietly in the passenger seat, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't spoken since they left the scene, but his mind was racing. He couldn't shake the image of the woman standing there, her children terrified and confused, as they had threatened to arrest her. He knew they had crossed a line. He could feel it deep in his gut, but he hadn't had the courage to say anything in the moment. Now the weight of their actions was pressing down on him, and he could feel the guilt rising like bile in his throat. Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice tentative. Do you think we went too far back there?" The older officer shot him a sharp glance, his lips thinning into a tight line. "We did our job," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We responded to a call. She didn't cooperate, so we had to take control of the situation." But even as he said the words, they felt hollow. Deep down, he knew that what had happened was more than just doing his job. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now it was coming back to haunt him. The younger officer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "But she was telling the truth. She's a judge. We could get in serious trouble for how we handled that." The older officer's hands tightened on the wheel, his jaw clenching harder. He didn't respond right away. the silence between them growing heavier with each passing second. He knew the younger officer was right. They had mishandled the situation, and now they were at risk of facing serious repercussions. But admitting that, to himself or anyone else, wasn't something he was ready to do. Back at home, Laura couldn't shake the anger that still simmered inside her. She knew she had done the right thing, but the injustice of the situation weighed heavily on her heart. She wanted those officers to understand the harm they had caused, not just to her, but to her children. The trauma they had inflicted wasn't something that could be easily erased. As she settled the boys down for the evening, she found herself replaying the confrontation in her mind, over and over again. The officers' cold stares, their refusal to back down, their blatant disregard for the truth, it all left a bitter taste in her mouth. But she wasn't going to let this end here. That night, after the boys were asleep, Laura sat down at her desk, pulled out her laptop, and began writing. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she crafted a formal complaint, detailing every aspect of the encounter. She was meticulous in her wording, ensuring that every fact was clear and undeniable. This wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about making sure that these officers and others like them were held accountable for their actions. Once the complaint was finished, she sat back in her chair, her mind still racing. The injustice she had experienced was one that far too many Black people faced every day. But as a judge, she had a platform, a voice that could make a difference. She wasn't going to stop with just a complaint. She was going to push for change, to fight for a system that truly protected everyone, regardless of their skin color. Laura knew that this was a battle that wouldn't be won overnight, but she was ready to fight. For her children, for her community, and for all those who had been silenced for too long. Several days later, as the older officer sat in his precinct, a heavy envelope was delivered to his desk. His name was printed neatly on the front, but as soon as he saw the return address, his stomach sank. It was from the courthouse. A formal complaint had been filed against him. His hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope, dread curling in the pit of his stomach. The details of the complaint were clear. He had overstepped his authority, acted out of bias, and threatened to arrest a judge without just cause. The words on the page seemed to burn into his mind, each sentence a reminder of his missteps. The younger officer, sitting nearby, glanced over at him, noticing the tension in his face. "What is it?" he asked quietly, though he already had a good idea of what was inside the envelope. The older officer didn't respond right away. He stared down at the complaint, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced with thoughts of the potential fallout, disciplinary action, suspension, or worse. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had made a serious mistake, and now there was no escaping the consequences. Finally, he looked up at his partner, his voice heavy with regret. "We're in trouble," he said simply. The younger officer nodded, his face grim. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words aloud made it all the more real. There was no going back now. They had crossed a line, and they were about to face the consequences of their actions. As the days passed, the weight of their mistake settled in for both officers. The older officer found himself replaying the encounter in his mind, unable to shake the image of Laura's face, the way she had stood her ground, the way she had revealed her identity with such quiet authority. He had misjudged her, just as he had misjudged so many others before her. But this time, there were consequences. This time, he couldn't just walk away from his actions. The formal complaint loomed over him, a constant reminder that his career was now in jeopardy. The younger officer, too, found himself grappling with his guilt. He had known deep down that what they were doing was wrong, but he hadn't spoken up. He hadn't stopped it. And now they were both paying the price. The complaint filed by Laura wasn't just a personal grievance. It was a catalyst for a larger investigation into the officer's conduct. As word spread about what had happened, the department launched a formal inquiry, and the officers found themselves under scrutiny like never before. Their superiors weren't happy, and it became clear that their actions had put their careers in jeopardy. For the older officer, the weight of the consequences was crushing. He had spent years building his career, and now it was all unraveling because of a single encounter. But he couldn't deny the truth anymore. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now he was paying the price. For the younger officer, the guilt was almost unbearable. He had stood by and done nothing, allowing the situation to escalate when he should have spoken up. And now, as the investigation moved forward, he knew that his silence had cost him dearly. As the investigation progressed, the officers were put on temporary suspension, awaiting the outcome of the inquiry. Their reputations were tarnished, their futures uncertain. But for Laura, the fight wasn't over. The consequences for the officers were just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done to change the system that had allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked for so long. And as she stood on the brink of a new chapter in her life, she knew that she was ready to continue the fight for justice, no matter how long it took. The afternoon sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm orange hue over the neighborhood as Laura made her way back home with Jake and Ben by her side. Though the immediate danger had passed, the weight of what had happened still hung heavy in the air, following them like a shadow. Laura's mind was swirling with thoughts, a mixture of relief, anger, and sadness. She had managed to protect her children from the worst of it, but the scars of the encounter would remain. As they approached their house, the boys were quiet. Ben still clung tightly to her hand, his eyes wide, as though he hadn't quite processed what had happened. Jake walked silently beside them, his face set in a determined frown, the earlier anger still bubbling just beneath the surface. They were both dealing with what had happened in their own ways, and Laura knew that it would take time for them to understand fully. As they entered their home, Laura felt a sense of safety wash over her, though it was tinged with the reality that this incident had altered the peaceful sanctuary she had worked so hard to create. She knelt down, pulling both of her boys into a tight hug, holding them close as though she could protect them from the world outside with her embrace alone. "We're home now," she whispered softly, her voice soothing. "We're safe." Ben buried his face in her shoulder, his small body still trembling slightly. "I was so scared, Mommy," he mumbled, his voice muffled. "Why were they so mean?" Jake, standing a little taller now, looked down at the floor, his young face still set in frustration. "They shouldn't have done that. It wasn't fair." Laura sighed softly, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long conversation. She had tried to shelter her children from the harsher realities of the world for as long as she could, but today had shattered that illusion. They had seen the ugliness of prejudice up close, and now it was her job to help them make sense of it. She guided them to the couch and sat down with them, her arms wrapped around both boys. "You're right, Jake. It wasn't fair," she said gently. "What those officers did was wrong, and I'm going to make sure they're held accountable for it. But I also want you both to know that this isn't how everyone in the world behaves. There are good people, people who treat others with respect and kindness. But sometimes we have to fight for that." Jake looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for answers. "But why do we have to fight? Why can't people just be fair?" Laura felt a pang in her heart. How could she explain centuries of systemic racism and prejudice to a child? How could she make them understand that the fight for equality was still far from over? "Sometimes people don't understand what's right," Laura said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes they've grown up with wrong ideas about other people, and they let those ideas control how they act. But that doesn't make it okay. That's why we have to keep standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Jake's frown deepened, his young mind still grappling with the injustice he had witnessed. "But you're a judge. You're supposed to be in charge. Why didn't they listen to you?" Laura's heart ached at the question. She could see the confusion and anger in her son's eyes, and she knew that this moment would shape his view of the world for years to come. He had seen firsthand that authority didn't always equate to justice, and that reality was a hard pill to swallow, even for an adult, let alone a child. "They didn't listen because they let their own prejudice get in the way," she explained gently. "They made assumptions about me because of the color of my skin, and they didn't want to see me for who I really am. But that doesn't mean I'm going to give up. I'm going to keep fighting, not just for us, but for everyone who faces the same kind of injustice." Ben, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up, his voice small but resolute. "Will they go to jail for what they did?" Laura shook her head softly. "No, they probably won't go to jail, but they will face consequences for their actions. What they did was wrong, and I'm going to make sure that people know about it. And more importantly, I'm going to keep working to change the system so that things like this happen less and less." Jake leaned against her, still trying to process everything. I don't like them, Mom. I don't like people who are mean like that. Laura hugged him tightly, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. I know, baby. I don't like it either. But the important thing is that we don't let their meanness make us angry or bitter. We have to keep our hearts kind and strong, even when the world isn't fair. That's how we make things better. She could feel the boys starting to relax a little, the warmth of their home providing a temporary refuge from the storm they had just weathered. But she knew that this conversation was far from over. This was only the beginning of their understanding of the world's complexities, and she would be there to guide them every step of the way. While Laura was comforting her children at home, the two officers were still grappling with the fallout of their actions. The older officer, sitting at his desk in the precinct, couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him since the confrontation. He had tried to convince himself that he had been doing his job, that he had followed protocol, but deep down he knew that wasn't the full story. His partner, the younger officer, had been silent for most of the ride back to the station, his face pale and his eyes distant. He hadn't spoken much since they parted ways, but his discomfort had been clear. Now, sitting across from the older officer, he finally broke the silence. "We messed up," the younger officer said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see her badge? She's a judge. We could lose our jobs over this." The older officer's jaw tightened. He didn't want to admit it, but the younger cop was right. They had crossed a line, and now they were facing the consequences. The formal complaint filed against them was the first step, but he knew it wouldn't be the last. Their reputations were on the line, and so were their careers. "I know," the older officer finally said, his voice heavy with regret. "We should have handled it differently, but now it's too late to change what happened." The younger officer leaned forward, his brow furrowed in worry. "Do you think we'll get fired?" The older officer didn't answer right away. He stared down at his hands, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent years building his career, and now it was all at risk because of one encounter, an encounter that had exposed his own deep-seated biases and mistakes. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but I know one thing. We're going to have to answer for what we did." As the days passed, the formal investigation into the officer's actions began in earnest. The complaint Laura had filed gained traction quickly, and it wasn't long before higher-ups within the police department were calling for a thorough review of the officer's conduct. The media had caught wind of the story as well, and soon news outlets were reporting on the incident, shining a spotlight on the officer's actions and raising questions about racial profiling in law enforcement. For Laura, the process was both exhausting and empowering. She had expected pushback, but she hadn't anticipated the level of public interest her case would attract. It seemed that many people were eager for a change, tired of seeing the same stories of injustice play out over and over again. Her complaint became a rallying point for those who wanted to see real reform in the way law enforcement handled situations involving race. At the same time, she remained focused on her family. Jake and Ben were slowly beginning to process what had happened, and Laura made sure to create a space for them to talk about their feelings whenever they needed to. She wanted them to understand that, while the world wasn't always fair, they had the power to stand up for what was right. As the investigation continued, Laura received updates from her lawyer, detailing the officer's suspensions and the potential for further disciplinary actions. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. She knew that real change would take time, but she was determined to see it through. Weeks later, the consequences for the officers became clear. Both were suspended without pay pending the outcome of the investigation, and there were rumors that they might be facing demotion or even dismissal. The older officer in particular found himself struggling to come to terms with the reality of what had happened. His career, once stable and secure, was now hanging by a thread, and all because of a decision made in a moment of prejudice. The younger officer, still haunted by the guilt of what he had allowed to happen, had started to reevaluate his role in law enforcement altogether. He had joined the force to make a difference, to help people, but now he wasn't sure if he was part of the solution or part of the problem. The encounter with Laura had forced him to confront his own biases, and the reflection that followed was uncomfortable but necessary. For both men, the fallout from their actions was a harsh wake-up call. They had thought they were simply doing their jobs, but now they were facing the reality that their behavior had real and lasting consequences. not just for their careers, but for the lives of the people they had wronged. Back at home, as the investigation neared its conclusion, Laura took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The fight for justice was ongoing, and she knew that her battle wasn't over yet. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to keep pushing forward, no matter how hard it might be. She had stood her ground in the face of prejudice, and she had won. But more than that, she had shown her children that they could be strong, even when the world was against them. She had taught them the value of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As she sat at her desk preparing for another day in court, Laura glanced out the window, watching the sun begin to set over the horizon. The world outside was still filled with challenges, still imperfect, but she was ready to face it head-on, because she knew that the fight for justice wasn't just about one moment or one encounter. It was a lifelong commitment, and she was ready to keep fighting for her children, for her community, and for the future they all deserved. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. Be sure to leave your comments. We value your opinion. And don't forget to watch our other videos. Each story will make you think and inspire you to change. Click on one of them right now.